Hey guys, today we're going to be repairing this vintage hand-sewn sweater and denim quilt. Now this quilt belongs to a family member and they gave it to me because it needed some repair. We can see this video is sped up just a little bit, but I'm going through kind of all the edges here. The binding is pretty much shot on this quilt. It is kind of tattered and frayed, and there's no hope for the binding. And this was originally a fold over binding from the best I could tell, and it was all, this whole thing is hand stitched. It's pretty awesome as a quilt because it's soft, it's warm like your favorite sweater and your favorite pair of jeans all in one. It's super soft denim and super soft sweaters. I think this was panels of sweaters, the best I can tell. But the binding has been frayed beyond repair. It is separating because of that here, so we're going to deal with some of these separate layers as we remove the original binding or trim these frayed edges. And with this being a quilt made up of sweaters or panels of sweaters, I had some fear that if I trimmed this kind of tattered binding off, not only would I be left with kind of a separate layers as it's separating on the edge there, but also the sweater panels, you know, they can unravel if you cut them. And so I really thought about this on how to, you know, do I just want to cover the old binding with some new, or do I want to actually, you know, get all that off of there? And it was really kind of tattered and bulky. It needed to be trimmed. Trimming the very edge was a possibility, but this had so much wear in some places than others that there was no way to get that done evenly. So what I decided to do with this was to actually run this through my serger machine, and this allowed me to cut these frayed and tattered edges off while at the same time kind of sealing the edge of this quilt. Making sure the layers stayed together and making sure that I didn't have any additional unraveling from the yarn from the sweater panels. And so that's what I chose to do. This is just showing the kind of the condition of this. This is a queen size quilt measuring approximately 62 by 83 or so, and that's after I trimmed the edges, so it was a little bit bigger than that. But yeah, so that's how we're going to do this. So to get this started into my serger machine, I ended up having to make a little cut, a kind of a split if you will, to get it fed into the machine. Otherwise it was kind of too much for the machine to handle. And these next clips are sped up quite a bit, but just show that I'm able to serge the binding off, trim the binding off, and leave a serged edge around this quilt, and that is going to hold the layers together, stop any additional kind of fraying of the panels, and just give me kind of a neater edge to work with and do some reinforcement on the edge of this quilt, because I don't only want to repair it so it looks better and can be used more, I want to try to make it a little stronger than it was, because it's a vintage quilt. It's an older quilt, and obviously it's been well used and well loved, but that also means you know, there's only so much repair you can do to these sweaters unless you're going to take up kind of weaving into, you know, some new yarn into that. And so these clips are just showing that it is possible to just run this thing through your serger. It trims it, it seals the edges. It didn't like some of the bulky areas where there was a lot of fraying, but all in all it did a quite decent job of trimming this quilt up and giving me kind of a new edge to work with, and not having to worry about anything any more fraying or unraveling as I did work on this quilt. So one thing I'm working on here is trying to take some of these loose pulled threads from these sweater panels and get them secured back into the quilt. And so right now what you're seeing is I'm using some pair of long handled hemostats and using those to help me with these short and with these kind of fragile threads to tie a little bit of a knot. So I take the loose thread and kind of wrap it around back in on itself and pull it through, kind of making a little, I think it's a quilter's knot, but trying to just to get these threads secured, because there's going to be, you know, every cloth will have some picked areas on it where you know, it's just the wear with time, or maybe there was a pet involved picking on this, but all in all there were a lot of loose threads. So for some of these, what I ended up doing, if I couldn't tie them, the ones that I could tie easily, I secured that way. And some of them, if they were near a seam, what I ended up doing was just kind of passing them back under the panel of the quilt to kind of get it back on the inside. And then because some of these seams were coming undone, I did have it planned to go over this quilt on the seams and to kind of secure the edges of those panels kind of in the crisscross fashion, in the square checkerboard fashion that they're sewn in. I went through and kind of went over the seams. And so when I'm tucking these threads into underneath the panels, I'm trying to get them towards the edges of the panel, where hopefully the machine, the sewing machine, is going to help secure some of these others when I sew over those panels. So here's an example of the seam that's starting to split on this quilt. Now for some of these I hand stitched some areas back together. For the most part though, I kind of put them back together and went over it with my sewing machine to reinforce what was going on and to just reinforce the seams. Now I used a black thread on top because of all the different colors of the sweater material. The black thread blended in the best that it was going to, and then on the back I used a thread that matched the denim, and so from the back it just looks like more or less like the original quilting, and then from the top you can't really, you know, you can see the black thread if you look closely at some of the panels, but it's within the seams and it's adding more stability to this quilt. So now that everything has been reinforced on the top of the quilt, I needed to add some binding. Now I thought about using just a pre-made bias tape binding in black because that would have worked with this quilt. But when I looked at it and how, you know, you feel how soft this denim is, it really would have been a disservice to do that, to change the look of the quilt that dramatically. And so what I ended up doing was I had some pretty lightweight denim fabric already, and it was a close match. I'm not sure with the natural fading over time that there was a way to get a perfect match for this denim, but I got fairly close. And so what I did was cut binding strips. I used a guide I found online for a queen size quilt to tell me kind of how many strips to cut. And then I used I think this ruler is called a shape cut ruler, and it lets you cut binding strips like this. Just, you can fold your fabric up and you're cutting long strips with your rotary cutter through the perforations on this ruler, and this worked very well. Now once you have your binding strips cut out, there's a lot of videos on YouTube about how to put binding strips together and how to attach them to your quilt. And so I highly recommend watching a few of those until you kind of know your plan on this. But you take the strips, you sew them together on the diagonal, trim off the excess, and you do this for all the strips, so you have one long piece that goes around the entire quilt. And you sew them together diagonally to prevent bulk at the seams. It kind of splits your seams a little bit. So you go ahead and do that. There are different ways to bind it, where you fold the binding material in half, you sew that to your quilt, then you fold it over again so you're sewing on a finished edge and it's all the same. Now, the reason for doing this is to try to kind of hide your stitches, get everything kind of nice and neat, and that's definitely the proper way to bind a quilt. I think that's the tested, the time-tested way, but I didn't do that because I look at a problem and I kind of have my own way to solve things. And so here you'll see I took the binding strip and basically right sides together, although you can't really tell the difference between the sides of this denim fabric, but right sides together for your quilt, and you sew this to the edge, and you go all the way around your quilt. Pay attention to your corners, watch those videos and let them show you how to do it, again and again, and you'll go all the way around. So now I'm flipping the quilt over to the back, pulling that binding that I just sewed onto the front, I'm pulling it to the back, and I'm doing kind of a wider binding on the back there, and just folding it over a little bit at the edge and sewing right on the edge of this binding. And I'm doing that for a couple of reasons. One, my quilt edge was not super square because I trimmed it and serged all the edges, and even in this picture you can see some of the areas on the serged edge which were not perfect, and it was going to be hard to get kind of a perfect little 2-inch 1-inch little binding that all fit all the way around. The other reason is because I want reinforcement on this quilt. There's strings unraveling, the edges were kind of shot, and so I wanted more binding on the back so I could sew kind of almost an inch into the quilt there, and not only attach my binding, but it reinforces the top. And so what I did for this binding, I've changed the thread around, but when I was sewing on the top, I had the black thread on top with a denim thread in my bobbin. Now I have the denim thread on top and a black thread in my bobbin, and I basically sew this binding on. Pay attention to the corners, and one thing that you will see is when I'm done with the corners, I actually went back and stitched over the folded edge. Not really for any particular reason other than reinforcement. I didn't want anything to kind of be loose or able to get caught on something or pulled. I wanted to reinforce this because it had been a well-loved quilt and had its issues. So for the areas of the quilt that had significant holes, and there were a few, you have a couple of options. One, you can put a patch over these. There was already one patch on this quilt, and you can do a hand stitched patch and only go halfway through so it doesn't show on the back, but that's not going to reinforce it as well as a full thickness patch over everything. And of course that's going to change the more patches you put on. The more it's going to change the look of your quilt, and eventually you may have more damage and you'll have to start patching areas. But for me, I chose to just reinforce this with some stitching, and you can do a darning technique, which I did on some of the other areas, and that's going to look a little more messy on the back. For this particular hole, what I did was just stitch straight lines going kind of with the lines of the fabric, and stitched a few straight lines just to reinforce everything there, and this is what it looks like on the back. So let's take a look at the finished quilt here. This looks a lot better than the ragged edged pile of quilt we started out with. This actually looks like a new quilt, but it has a brand new binding that very closely matches the original. It has new top stitching along the edge of the sweater panels. It has reinforcement all the way through the quilt. And if you're looking at the back here, you can't really at a distance, at just looking at it, an overlook of it, you can't really tell the extra stitching that I added from the original stitching that was there. Now if you look closely, you're going to be able to pinpoint to pick out hand stitching versus machine stitching, and you're going to see the repairs that I did. But overall, I repaired this quilt, I reinforced this quilt, and I did not change the original look of the quilt. I just kind of restored it to its former glory, and now hopefully it'll still be a beloved quilt that'll keep somebody warm for many years to come. And it was a fun project to do. I've only made one other quilt. That's the t-shirt quilt on my channel, and this was a interesting repair job, and I'm very pleased with how it turned out. And there's going to be more projects to come. So if you found this video interesting or helpful, hopefully both, go ahead and click that like and subscribe button and stay tuned for more. Thanks, guys.